Chapter 18. The moment Petra slid underwater, everything changed. All those years she couldn't swim, they just poured away. She was in and under and moving through the dark, silky water. Her sight was blurry. Light slanted down between the water lilies floating overhead. The feel of the water against her face. It was like she was 11 years old before everything went wrong. She didn't want to surface. She pulled again and again toward the tipped canoe. She felt her tiny tail twitch as if it wanted to help steer. Were things getting clearer? Everything had been so murky at first, but now, if she really concentrated, things were more in focus. It was a strange underwater forest. The water lily stems were like skinny tree trunks rising from the pond's bottom. Beneath the finely veiled lily plants, she could see this now, sprouted all sorts of little wavy tendrils, and some of them were wrapped around dead fish and frogs, a squirrel, and even off to her right, what looked like a decomposing raccoon. She felt amazingly calm. This is just what these plants did. They ate things. How long had she been under? It felt like a long time, but she didn't need a breath yet. Up ahead was the long shadow of a capsized canoe. Below, on the lake bed, were backpacks and gear that must have fallen out when it tipped. She surfaced inside the upside-down boat and took a breath of the dank, trapped air. Light slanted through the bullet-sized holes in the hull. Treading water, Petra blinked hard. It took several tries before her eyes refocused after being underwater, and when they did, she stifled a yell. Bobbing at the far end of the canoe was a bloated body of a man. A water lily grew from his gaping mouth. Even in her terror, she recognized the strange bat-shaped leaves, the same as the tiny plant that had grown in her bottle of rainwater. But that baby plant hadn't been a big cone of purple flowers that now turned toward her neck with a menacing creak, bristling with sharp seeds. Instinct took over. Her hands shot out, grabbed the lily stem, and snapped it. Almost at once, the flower's head curled and dipped lifelessly into the water. With her feet, Petra pushed the dead body outside the canoe. She heard shouting and put her eye to one of the holes in the side. All around the canoe were lilies with their flowered heads raised, one rear back, and she heard a hail-like clatter against the hull. These things shot seeds. A new ray of light pierced the gloom as another tiny hole slowly opened in the boat's side. She touched the still hissing rim and rubbed the sticky goo between her fingers. Must be acid, but she felt no burning. Slowly she rotated the canoe so she was looking back to shore. Her breath snagged. It was total mayhem. Vines were dropping from the sky, trying to snare Anaya and the others, and there was a cluster of water lilies, their flowered heads lifted high and recoiling as they pumped out seeds. Dr. Weber was being lifted into the air, and Anaya had jumped to grab her. Petra had never seen anyone jump so high from standing. As fast as she could, Petra started swimming the canoe back to shore. Water lilies brushed past, seeds hailed against the hull. She thought she heard a big splash from the back out in the lake, and shouting, she kept going. When she was near the shore, she gave the canoe a good shove to send it the rest of the way. Then she dived underwater and swam hard for land. This time, when she opened her eyes, it went from blurry to clear in seconds. Her eyes ached a bit, and she got the sense that she was actually shrinking her pupils, changing the entire shape of her eyes in their sockets. She saw the cluster of water lilies that were firing at everyone. She saw the long stems that tethered these plants to the lake bed. She grabbed the nearest one and yanked. It was thick and really anchored in the mud. With both hands she pulled, and this time the stem tore loose. She went to the next lily and the next, ripping. Their flower heads sank uselessly into the water. When she'd torn out the last stem, she surfaced and waded into the shallows. Water and muck streamed off her like some swamp monster, but she'd never felt so exultant. "I swam," she cried out, unable to hide her joy. Then she grabbed the canoe and flipped it right side up. "Come on," she shouted to the others. "Get in." Anaya crouched low, her face pressed against the canoe's slimy bottom. There wasn't space to lie completely flat, but she and Seth and Dr. Weber all squished themselves as small as possible. Underwater, Petra was ferrying them across the lake to the island, toward Dad. Anaya stayed very still and quiet, watching water leak through the small holes in the hull. Dr. Weber still had her gas mask on, although Anaya had noticed that the sleeping gas seemed much weaker by the lake. or maybe its smell was just overpowered by the rotten egg stench of the water itself. Quite a puddle had formed at the canoe's bottom, and I hoped they were close, but she didn't dare lift her head to check, in case the lilies started firing again. Dr. Weber had been hit twice in the legs. There wasn't time to do anything to help her right now. Anaya just wanted to get to Dad. She hadn't heard his voice in a while, and was feeling even more anxious. Something landed on her back and uncurled toward her arm. She struck it off with her hand and lifted her head to look. Vines dangled down all around them. Most were still, very still, as the canoe glided past, but a few were now questing after the boat, including the one she'd just brushed off. It came curling back toward her like a hook. "Seth," she hissed. In the canoe's middle section, Seth raised himself up and slashed out with his feathered arm. The severed vine fell into the water. More came. She heard the chirp of the lily seeds whistling past. "Stay down," she said to Dr. Weber, who was crouched at the bow. Vines wriggled all around them now, and Seth lunged to and fro, cutting them. The canoe rocked violently, and Anaya worried they'd tip. She gave a yelp of surprise as the boat's stern lifted right out of the water, followed by the bow. Peering over the side, she saw that the vines had encircled the canoe and were lifting the entire boat toward the seething canopy. Seth pulled his arm back to strike the vine holding the stern. "Wait," cried Anaya, but too late. Seth sliced through, and the stern plummeted. Anaya tumbled backward into the air, along with Seth and Dr. Weber, still wearing her gas mask. In those few seconds, she saw the lake and Petra treading water and staring up at them in shock, and a cluster of dripping water lilies, and the shore of the small island, Dad gazing up at them, and the only encouraging thing was that they were close to the island. With a great splash, she hit the water and went underwater. She spluttered up and started swimming for shore. Seth thrashed beside her, his feathered arms making him clumsy. Spluttering, Dr. Weber tried to drag off her gas mask, which was filling with water. Anaya came closer and fumbled the straps loose for her, and the doctor ripped the mask off, gasping. Anaya made a grab for the mask, but it was already sinking, and the seeds were flying everywhere, and they needed to get to land. She swam alongside Dr. Weber, trying to shield her. Seeds stung her in the head and shoulder, and she kept her face low. Suddenly, there was a water lily right in front of them, rearing ready to shoot. Without warning, the whole plant got dragged underwater, and Petra surfaced in its place, standing. The lilies snapped roots, hanging from her clenched fist. "Come on," Petra yelled, grabbing Dr. Weber by the hand and pulling her into the shallows. Anaya staggered to her feet and slogged the rest of the way to the shore. Straight ahead was Dad, urgently waving them in. "Come away from the water. They're attracted by sound and movement." He was completely caked in dirt, his hair filthy, matted mess. A damp cloth was tied around his mouth and nose, and what she saw of his face looked red and blistered, as did his hands. But it was Dad, and Anaya felt such a flood of relief and joy. She ran and threw her arms around him. Instead of hugging her back, her father started smearing dirt on her face and hair. "What are you doing?" she cried. "All over," Dad shouted to the others, looking crazed. "It keeps the vines away. It's toxic to them. On your clothes, too. Yep, don't forget your shoes. They love ankles." Even as he spoke, vines came curling down from overhead. Anaya didn't hesitate. She scooped up some dirt and plastered it over her upper body. When a snaky black tendril touched her dirty shoulder, it recoiled as if it was scorched. They were all covering themselves as fast as they could, but the vines were quicker. Anaya saw one slyly wrapping around Petra's leg. "Petra, look out!" "Got it," said Seth. He flared the feathers on his right arm and severed the vine with one quick blow. "Whoa," said Dad, staring at Seth and his barbed arms. "Hi, Mr. Riggs," said Seth. And it suddenly struck Anaya how much her father didn't know. About the plants being invasive species from another planet, about how his own daughter was half cryptogen. Seth stood guard and slashed more vines, while she and the others frantically covered themselves with dirt. Dad made sure Seth was caked back in front. A few vines hovered around Dad, darting at him like hissing snakes, but never quite touching. Covered in dirt, Anaya looked around nervously. The vines nosed around them for a bit, and then, as one, pulled back up onto the canopy where she could see their canoe cocooned by vines. "This way," Dad said, leading them quickly through the splintered stalks of black grass. It really is dead, Anaya said, kicking at the stubble. It was incredibly satisfying to see it like this. Dad brought them to a big boulder. On one side was a very small cave, maybe an old animal burrow that Dad had enlarged onto a shelter just big enough for a single body. Inside, Anaya saw a backpack and some trail snacks and bottles of water. Are you okay? Dad asked, looking at her closely. And then Seth and Petra? No seeds. You're sure? He frowned. The water didn't burn you guys at all? Anaya shook her head. We're fine, but Dr. Weber. Her father grabbed the bottle from his shelter and turned to the doctor. Coffee break. Wicked, you want to say hi? No? Okay. Where were we? Her father grabbed the bottle from his shelter and turned to the doctor. Tilt your head back, he told her. I'll sluice your eyes. Dr. Weber's skin had erupted in a red rash from the lake water, and her eyes were nearly swollen shut. Thanks, she said tightly. Happened to me too, Anaya's father told her. I was in the water a lot longer. It's a severe reaction, but it gets better. I was nearly blind for a couple hours. Who are you, by the way? Dr. Stephanie Weber, Canadian Intelligence. What's changed the water? Petra asked. Is it those lily plants? Anaya's father nodded. I noticed the same thing in the lab. They changed the acidity of the water. They also seem to exhale methane. That's the rotten egg smell. He looked at Dr. Weber. Did you get hit by any seeds? My leg. We need to get them out fast. Anaya helped Dr. Weber pull up the leg of her acid-scorched trousers. In her calf were 2 red welts, where the seeds had burned themselves into her flesh. Only their sharp tips jutted out. Anaya, can you do it? Dad asked. My fingers are still a bit swollen. You might have to dig a bit. Sorry, she said to Dr. Weber in advance, and gouged out one seed then the other with her fingernails. Thanks, Anaya, said Dr. Weber, wincing. They germinate really fast, Dad said, and lowered his bandana. Anaya sucked in her breath. On his neck was a raised welt with a small black tendril curling out of it. Anaya felt a squeeze of horror. One of those plants was growing out of him. Oh my gosh, Dad! I couldn't get the seed out, then it sprouted. I've torn it off a few times, but it just grows back. Let me have a look, said Dr. Weber, peering with her swollen eyes. She prodded gently around the wound with her fingers. It's very deep. It needs to be cut out. Can you do it? Anaya asked. It's too close to the artery. A surgeon needs to do it. Anaya scratched at her own neck, feeling a sympathetic itchiness. We'll worry about that later, Dad said, tying the bandana back over his nose and mouth. Here, you'll want to do the same, he said, handing Dr. Weber a strip of ripped t-shirt, sluiced with water. The sleeping gas from the vines, I know, the doctor said, tying it around her face. It was way worse in the forest, Anaya said, sniffing the air. I think the breeze helps clear it away, Dad said. You guys aren't affected? He asked, looking at Anaya. No, she said, and saw his puzzlement. But she wanted to put off telling him as long as possible. Okay, he said. I saw your helicopter. Who else was on it? 2 pilots, she told him. They died in the crash, and there were 2 military officers. The vines got jolly, and she didn't need to say any more. Her father must have seen what happened to Brock. Can we expect cavalry? Dad asked Dr. Weber. The captain said they might send a rescue team before nightfall. Maybe. Dad, and I asked, what happened to you? Is Emmett dead? Said Petra. He was under the canoe. Anaya saw Dad nod and take a breath. When we got here yesterday morning, that wall of black grass wasn't nearly so high or thick. Only a few vines crisscrossed overhead. We took the canoe out. Halfway across, we stopped to take a closer look at the lilies. I was pretty sure they were the same ones I had growing in the lab. They clustered around the boat and started shooting. I got hit a few times, but Emmett got the worst of it. When he fell out, the canoe tipped and everything went in, except the backpack I was wearing. The water got in my eyes and I could barely see. Emmett went under before I could reach him. So awful, said Anaya, scratching again at her neck. She must have gotten a mosquito bite. I made it to the island, Dad continued. My skin was seared and both my eyes were swollen shut, but after a few hours my vision started coming back. He gestured across the lake to the stockade. By then, the wall was even thicker, and more vines were weaving over the lake. Incredible, murmured Dr. Weber. They really are hiding it. They started coming for me then, and that's when I found out they didn't like the soil. I also figured out They were all growing from one place. He pointed across the lake to a marshy spot on the shoreline. A colossal tangle of vines, the width of a car, grew straight up, higher than the black grass, and into the trees behind it. It's a monster pit plant over there, Seth said. I saw it open when the black vines caught Brock. They were carrying him over to it, and they were going to dump him right in. Pit plant, Anaya's father said. That's a good name for them. Before we got to the lake, Amit and I almost fell into one. Anaya could see Dad studying Seth's feathers. Worriedly, he glanced down at her clawed toes sticking through her ripped socks and tried to pull them back in, but they were too long now, and she lifted her eyes. Her father's gaze met hers. He must know, she thought. Dad, she said helplessly. It's okay, he said. And he reached for her. As he reached for her, she started to cry. It was not okay. How could it ever be okay? She was not what she used to be, and never had been. From the moment of her birth, she'd been something different, and now could her father possibly accept her? But he held her tightly as her shoulders shook and said nice things to her, into her ear, some of the same things he'd said when she was little and sobbing like this. Gently, she pulled away and took a deep breath. She felt bad for Petra and Seth not having anyone to blubber all over. Seth was staring at his hands, scratching at a knuckle. Dad looked at Dr. Weber and said, What can you tell me? She said, You already knew the plants were cryptogenic, yes? Yes. And I gaped, You did, and you didn't tell me or Mum? Mum knew. I didn't want to terrify you. To Dr. Weber, he said, Keep going, please. Anaya was happy to let Dr. Weber tell it, about how only half their DNA was human, about how they were changing. The doctor was calm and thorough. She made it sound scientific and somehow less personal, when really, what could be more personal than the fact that your daughter was half cryptogen and you weren't even the father? Anaya watched Dad most carefully during this last part, dreading how he'd react. Would something die in his eyes when he looked at her next? Would he be frightened of her? He listened to all of it, and then nodded and said, Okay. He scratched at his filthy hair and squinted up at the writhing mass of vines overhead. This is a lot. He tried to grin. Quite a day. He took her hands in his. As far as I'm concerned, not one thing has changed. You're my daughter. That will never stop. She smiled gratefully and so relieved and tried hard not to start crying all over again. She scratched at her neck. The other side was itchy now, too. There must be tons of mosquitoes here. We have a lot to talk about, Dad said, but right now we need to get the soil off the island. It works. It really kills the plants? She asked. You're sure? I'll show you. He led them away from his makeshift shelter. Anaya glanced overhead to check the vines, still coiling over one another like restless snakes. A few dropped down to nose around her head, then retreated hastily. I didn't know how long I'd be here, Dad said, so I thought I'd better make time count. When the vines were dropping down on me, I managed to snap a few of the tendrils and replant them. He came to a stop and pointed, Here. In admiration, Anaya looked at the small patch of cleared earth that her father had turned into a test plot. How many people, with their lives at risk, would have the discipline and courage to run a science experiment? I planted 3 tendrils. I even snared a young water lily that hadn't developed its flower head yet. I planted that too. Anaya studied the wizened plants. They all sagged, their leaves limp and yellow against the earth. Whatever's in this soil, it's a potent toxin to the plant, Dad said. Any theories? What that is exactly? Dr. Weber asked. Bacterium, but we won't know until we isolate it in a lab. Why here? Seth asked. Why is this soil special? You sometimes get these rare fungal ecosystems in isolated places, like the South American rainforest, totally unique bacteria. Same thing here. If we can isolate it and culture it, we might have a way to kill these rotters on a mass scale. Rotters. Anaya couldn't help grinning. She felt a strengthening pulse of excitement and hope, a way of killing all the plants. Possible. How long did it take? Seth pointed at the withered plants in the plot for them to die. Within an hour. Anaya scratched at her neck, and then noticed that Seth was scratching at his hand. She glanced over at Petra, who was rubbing her cheek. Beneath the dirt on her friend's face, Anaya saw a red patch of skin. The soil, she breathed. Petra looked over at her. What? We're allergic to it, too. Let me see, said Dr. Weber, peering at her neck, then at Petra and Seth. I think you're right. Is it very itchy? Seth shook his head, just like a mosquito bite. Makes sense, Anaya's father said, since you guys have some of the same DNA as the plants. Dr. Weber said, the reaction looks fairly mild, but we need to keep an eye on it. If it spreads, or if you have any shortness of breath, tell me. Shouldn't we wash the dirt off? Petra said worriedly. No, said Anaya, or the vines will take us. She'd put up with a little itchiness to keep those things off of her. Petra pointed at the wilted plants. It killed them. How do we know it won't kill us? Anaya felt a squeeze of fear around her throat. She'd gotten used to being the one who was immune to all these new dangers, the acid, the sleeping gas, the searing water. Now it turned out she was vulnerable to dirt from her own planet, just like the cryptogenic plants. Remember, said Dr. Weber, you only share a small amount of the plant's DNA. Those vines can't even touch the dirt. You guys have very mild reactions by comparison. Still, said Anaya's father, I don't like it. The sooner they can clean off, the better. We better get out of here. We've only got a couple more hours of light. We're not getting that canoe back, said Seth, looking at the boat, snarled up in vines. Anaya exhaled. Without the boat, they were stranded. We could swim, Petra reminded them. I don't think Dr. Weber and I would make it, said Anaya's father, even if it weren't for the lilies. I could rip them out, said Petra. Too many of them, said Seth. Even if we did make it across, said Dr. Weber, then what? There's our boat at the dock, Petra said to Anaya's father. There's your boat at the dock, Petra said to Anaya's father. And a whole forest of vines and pit plants to get through, said Anaya. Well, we can't just wait around, said Petra. What if they don't send a rescue team? Even if they send another helicopter, they wouldn't see us through the vines. She was right. Anaya stared up into the dense weave of the vines. Already the small hole they'd burned was sealing itself up. Those things were unstoppable. She traced them back to the massive pit plant on the opposite shore. How much soil do you think it would take to kill that big pit plant? She asked Dad, pointing to the shore. I don't know why. She looked over at Petra, who was nodding with her. That's where all the vines came from. We kill the pit plant, then all the vines die, right? If the vines die, a helicopter can see us. And the canoe falls down, said Seth. Even if there's no rescue, at least we've got a boat, and no vines to capsize us. Frowning, Dr. Weber looked across to the pit plant on the shore. How could we even get close to that thing? Anaya took a breath, exhaled. I let it eat me. Seth looked at her in shock, and then at Mr. Riggs, who was about to speak, but Anaya cut him off. I load myself up with as much soil as I can carry. I wash the dirt off myself and let the vines grab me. They'll feed me right into the pit plant. Despite himself, Seth agreed with her logic. The plant must be hungry. It hadn't eaten broth. Even with all its vines collecting light and eating small animals, that enormous pit plant would need a ton of food to keep itself going. Excuse me. Absolutely not, Mr. Riggs said. Way too risky. If anyone does it, it's me. Dad, it'll kill you, Anaya said. The acid doesn't hurt me. I go in, dump the soil, and get right out. I can jump really high now. Didn't you see me? What if it seals you inside? Mr. Riggs asked. I'll cut my way out. I'll take your knife. And I've got these. She pointed to the claws jabbing through her socked feet. And she won't be doing it alone, Seth said. There was no way he was letting Anaya do this by herself. He held out his spiky arms. He just sawed through the wall of black grass. He was pretty sure he could slash his way out of a pit plant. I'm going with her. Anaya turned to him, and Seth didn't think anyone had ever looked at him with such gratitude. Me too, said Petra. You guys, Anaya began to say, but Petra cut her off. With the three of us, that thing doesn't stand a chance. Seth knew it was just tough talk, but they needed all the toughness they could muster right now. He looked over at Mr. Riggs. He didn't say okay, but he didn't say no either. Seth figured he must know this might be their only way off the island. There was no more debate. They dumped out Mr. Riggs's backpack and filled every compartment to bursting with soil. Seth took off his hoodie and knotted it into a sack, and they loaded that up too. For good measure, all three of them crammed their pockets with more soil. Listen to me, Mr. Riggs said sternly. If anything starts feeling wrong, anything, you cut loose, all right? Even if you don't get to the pit plant, you bail. Understand? Let's wash, said Petra. I want this dirt off me. Be careful, Dr. Weber said, and Seth noticed her eyes rested longest on him. It was a tender look, something he'd seen plenty of times in movies, but hardly at all in real life. He felt like he'd been given an amazing gift. Down at the shore, he splashed water on his head. Keep it dirty around your neck and nose, Anaya said. It's so itchy, though, Petra complained. Yeah, but we don't want them choking us or going up our nostrils. Good point, Petra agreed. Seth kept his arms dirty, too. He needed his arms and feathers completely free so he could slash and cut. He looked at Petra and Anaya, standing beside him on the shore, hair dripping, clothes sodden. They were not the picture of likely heroes. As Anaya shrugged the bulging backpack over both shoulders, he reached for his soil-packed hoodie. Petra got to it first. Keep your hands free, she told him. You're the muscle. He felt himself blush and couldn't help smiling. The muscle. Mr. Riggs zipped his knife like a chemical light stick to a small outer pocket of Anaya's backpack and hugged his daughter tight. It'll work, Anaya said, but she was trembling, and Seth didn't think it was just the cold water. Mr. Riggs retreated, and suddenly the vines were whipping everywhere. Anaya got snared around her arms and ankles and yanked into the air. They took Petra next, and the soil-filled hoodie hugged tight to her chest. And then it was Seth's turn. Spiraling around his ankles, the vines gripped so tight he grunted in pain. They flipped him upside down and whipped him skyward. His stomach slewed as he soared up. But for one ecstatic moment, it was almost like he was flying. Below, the two grown-ups were already so small. He was lifted right underneath the squirming canopy. Different vines came and took hold of his legs. Others released, and then he realized he was being passed along over the lake. In front of him, the vines were doing the same to Petra and Anaya, deftly shunting them toward the shore. The ground trembled and then split open in a vast gash. His insides went cold. He hadn't fully appreciated how huge this thing was. From this height, he could see its wet walls through his bottom was hidden in darkness. You okay? He shouted to the girls. Okay, Petra grunted back. A few stray vines oozed past his dirty feathered arms, but backed off. One brushed his cheek, but darted away when it touched the soil around his nose. He wished they would flip him right side up, but apart from that, everything was going according to plan. On the shoreline, the pit plant trembled and began opening up. Its fleshy lips made a hissing sound as they pulled wide. The thing was so enormous. Seth watched as the vines carried Anaya directly over the pit plant and then dropped her. He cried out in shock. She couldn't survive that fall. But then, 10 feet above the pit plant, Anaya bounced back, tethered by a single remaining vine around her ankle, like a bungee cord. She bounced a few more times, and then only when she stopped did the vine release her. Anaya plunged into the pit plant and disappeared. Seth swallowed. It must be deep. He wasn't looking forward to his turn. He calmed himself by going through the plan. Dump all the soil inside and get out, cutting his way through the top of the sealed, if it's sealed on them. They should be out in 3 minutes. He realized he wasn't moving anymore. Hanging upside down, twirling slowly from side to side, he felt suddenly lightheaded and breathless. His heart stuttered. He dangled over the lake like a piece of meat on a hook. What's going on? Petra called back to him. I don't know. Can you see anything? No, it's too deep. What's happening? He heard Mr. Riggs shout from the island. On the shore, the pit plant's lips started to constrict. It's closing, Seth shouted. It wasn't supposed to do that, but it didn't stop until the lips had mashed themselves together, sealing Anaya inside, alone. End of chapter 18.